these two together, the ability to interact with people and the ability to create models, and you now have the ability to have a God.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that the fact that we have brains that tend to construct personalities, we use it for real persons, for working out how another person might react when we do something. So we
Yes.
almost we run a kind of simulation of what it's like to be another person. And so we tend to be so good at that we tend to generalize that to the weather becomes a person, the river becomes a person, thunder becomes a person. And that may be one of the ways
The
in which...
anthropomorphization of objects.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I constantly come back to the need to explain it by explaining why we have psychological mechanisms like we do. So I think we agree, apart from the fact that when it comes to the Darwinian survival value, you want to say the survival value is that groups that have this characteristic survive better than groups that don't. I want to say individuals that have this characteristic of, for example, being obedient to authority
Now,
survive better.
I guess the way that I would probably contest that point is by another concept that you've promoted very strongly, which is memes, memetics, and this sort of thing. And if you like, those are now more powerful concepts in determining the potency of a civilization than the actual genetics. For instance, the people in Iraq are virtually the same as the people in America. But because of the knowledge that it changes the ability of these civilizations to fight by orders of magnitude that you can never get out of the genetics.
Well, if we're going to bring in memes, remember that the whole point about meme theory is that it's the memes themselves that survive relative to other memes. It's not societies that survive. We're not talking about a group of people.
Carriers. Yes.
Well, you can call them carriers if you like, but I mean, the point is what we're talking about is that which memes survive and which ones don't. The ones that survive are the ones that survive, just like the genes that survive.
Yes, successful patterns propagate.
Yes, but just as genes don't survive because groups survive, they survive because individuals survive.
Yeah.
Memes don't survive because groups survive, or maybe they do in some way.
There is a feedback.
There may be,
Yeah.
and probably individual survival is less important to meme survival in the sense that, unlike gene survival, where individual death is the main mechanism whereby some genes are cut off and others are not. Individual death is not the main mechanism whereby memes survive. We have to ask what is the main mechanism.
Yeah.
Some memes are more likely to get passed on, copied, inherited in that sense than others. So I see an analogy with computer viruses, where viruses just get passed from computer to computer because they're good at getting passed.
Yeah.
They have what it takes. They have what it takes to be copied. That's what memes have. And so an idea, whether it's a religious idea or any other, which is infectious, which has the ability to get itself jumped across, propagated from one individual to another, is what survives.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it all boils down to almost by definition true statement that more successful patterns propagate better than less successful.
That's right, and that sounds trite, it sounds trivial,
Yeah.
but when you're actually explaining why the world is full of certain patterns rather than others, that it does have explanatory value.
So comes the core question of why is religion pervasive in mankind? And I guess as a secondary question, why are some religions more potent than others?
Right. Well, let's go on talking about memes for a bit, although I don't usually do that. A meme complex is like a gene complex, and it's memes that go well together. So in an environment that's already dominated by a certain collection of memes, new ones that are compatible will tend to survive better than those that are not. And so a country which is already filled with Islamic memes, as opposed to a country that's already filled with Christian memes, for example.
Yeah.
If you think about the fate of a new one that arises,
again, it's sort of like evolution. There's a certain amount of energy in the environment, or a certain amount of capacity for the individuals to carry memes.
Yes.
And they can exclude other...
That's right. So that would be one way of looking at it. And another way would be to say that certain memes just have more... they're more attractive. They're more likely. I mean, say the idea that you survive your death might be a more attractive one than the idea that you're snuffed out of death, and even more attractive than the one that you go to fry in hell. This is not going to be simple, but it could be that one of the things that selects for certain memes rather than others is just simply what makes you feel good, which brings me back to how I started.
If I would put it forward as an interesting contrast, if you say take Newton, who arguably coined what you might say is meme, you might just call it knowledge, the Newtonian laws of motion, these propagate vastly more successfully than his DNA.
Yes.
Yeah, these are taught to millions of children every year, whereas Newton's genetics, who knows where they are.
Yes.
And this also comes to the interesting point that with genetic selection, it's an all or nothing. You have an organism that can be better or worse. With information, it accumulates. You don't usually accumulate bad ideas. So, for instance, someone might be, take Stephen Hawking, for instance, who arguably has, I don't know whether his syndrome is hereditary or not, but even if you are, let's say, for instance, you are socially reprehensible, antisocial, and so on, if you have one good idea, you can contribute that to the knowledge of mankind, and it stays there essentially in perpetuity.
The idea stays. That's right.
Genes
do
so
too.
Genes.
Yes.
It's an all or nothing. You either select the genome or you don't.
Not the genome. Genomes are constantly getting destroyed. Genes have been around for hundreds of millions of years, the successful ones. Moreover, I mean, there's quite a reasonable evidence that the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan is extremely widespread in Central Asia.
The crime gene is that the crime chromosome. If you have the male, you are 16 times more likely to be in jail as a male. I think it is.
Yes, well, that doesn't surprise me. But that doesn't have to be Genghis Khan's. I mean, it's certainly true that there is a Y chromosome which started with a single individual, which is exceedingly widespread in Central Asia, and the time period fits it being Genghis Khan. So, I mean, you could contrast that with Newton, where there's no reason to think that Newton's genes are still around. But that doesn't really get us anywhere. I mean, what we're trying to explain is why it is that people are gullible. There's all the psychological predispositions you need in order to be religious. You need to be gullible, obey authority, perhaps to believe things that just because they feel good rather than because there's any evidence for them. All those sorts of psychological...
If you believe that humans are genetically predisposed to form hierarchical structures, then you need essentially, well, you might say gullible people, but you need people who will obey instructions. I mean, otherwise you cannot have a hierarchical structure. I mean, that's the way that it works.
That's right. So that's a constructive way to think about religion, which would be then, you could see it as a byproduct of the fact that we've got predisposition to have a hierarchical, whatever psychological predispositions it takes in order to fit into a hierarchical society, for example. You could do it that way. I could imagine you developing a theory along those lines, and religion could be regarded as a byproduct of that.